Alright, time for another video. Let's talk about honesty regarding Casus Belli. Now, when you say Casus Belli, what you're effectively saying is cause for war, justification. So, for example, let's take the Mexican-American War as an example, 1845 to 48. What it was a war whose casus belli was Mexico attacked our people. That was the justification for the war. Now, in truth, the United States had other reasons for it, but that was the justification that they proposed to Congress when the war was declared. And war can be justified even if one doesn't like it. Again, Mexican-American War. Plenty of people didn't care for it. They thought it was just unjust expansion by the U.S. It was, maybe it wasn't, but it was still justified and had reasoning behind it, even if it was as simple as, I want that. See, justification does not mean that all actions are acceptable, or even that other goals aren't bigger concerns. It's just the reason you started a conflict. It's the justification to get troops on the ground. You could have 5 different backup reasons for something. For example, let's face it, the Nazis had several justifications for invading Poland. They wanted, of course, the territory that connected Prussia to the rest of Germany. They wanted Lebensraum, living space, for Germans. They wanted to have a good buffer with the Soviet Union. They wanted more resources, etc., etc., etc. They had plenty of reasons behind the war of Poland, but the official justification was, 1, the Polish didn't accept the German ultimatum, and 2, they had a skirmish in German territory with Polish troops. That was entirely staged, but regardless. Because of that, people started the war. That was the official justification. But things are often filled with other reasons. It's not just the cause for war that brings one in. It's just the reason that they tell everyone to justify it. See, people often get caught up in legalese, but really all the state needs is an excuse. Since once the war is going, well, who's exactly going to stop you? Your hands are pretty much tied if you're a civilian when it comes to military matters, because at that point that's the authority of the executive or the military themselves if they're a separate branch, like in several cases. See, for example, WMDs in Iraq, Taliban assistance to Al-Qaeda, etc., could be any number of things. Bombing our ships, stealing our people, it really doesn't matter necessarily. They're all justifications. And, by the way, for those who say there were no WMDs in Iraq, there were chemical weapons at Kirkuk. Chemical weapons are indeed WMDs. So yes, they did have them, even during the Iraq War. It's just a matter of, did you think the other things the U.S. did during the war were justified? That is the matter with Iraq. Technically, Bush was correct. To the level that one may say he was, that's more debatable, but there were indeed WMDs in Iraq. People may not like it, but that is the case. See, the fact of the matter is, when it comes to these justifications, you do not need to agree that a war is best, even if it is justified. Because the fact of the matter is, a justification is in function an excuse. There can be 80 different things that you want out of a war. You only need to pull up one thing to justify getting it started. WMDs were in Iraq. Okay, they got a report. Told president he wanted in on the war. Guarantee you, the United States had several other justifications besides that, but they went with the WMDs because it sounded best. Overthrowing a dictator, let's face it, the US has a bad track record when it comes to that. I doubt anyone would find it very, shall I say, viable, especially given the US's record with putting in dictators. Wanting to establish more control in the Middle East? Oh yeah, I'm sure people would love to hear that. Oil? I mean, we took it. Doesn't mean it's a thing that sounds good when it comes to invading a person or a state. Fact is, there can be many, many reasons to justify something. Even if it's justified, that does not make it the best to do. You do not need to agree that a war is a justifiable one, or rather, is worth it, even if it's justified. Again, Mexican-American War. Let's go back to that. Old 1840s. You can argue that the justification was flimsy, but the war did benefit the United States, without question, on a pure realpolitik level. The United States absolutely gained from that war. You got California, Texas, well, parts of Texas. The whole Texas thing was disputed territory, along with everything in between besides those that were purchased at the Gadsden Purchase. The United States gained a lot out of it, truthfully. So, could you argue that it was best, even if you would argue it's not justified? 100%. The reverse is also true with Iraq. Plenty of people would say that no, it was not best to invade Iraq, but it was still a justifiable war. Let's face it, people could come up with 10 justifications off the top of their head depending on their political orientation or views on geopolitics. Casus Belli is just the excuse. It's nothing more than that, really. If you want to look at a war, it's best not to look at the justification, but rather what's done during it, or the end goals of it. Because once you start a war, truthfully, your initial justification doesn't really matter. After all, sure, you could want one thing, at least state that you want one thing, but you could take 3 other things and leave the original just hanging. Completely irrelevant. Because what matters with a war is who wins and what leverage you have to negotiate at the end, or if there's even a state to negotiate with at the end. Sometimes there's not. That tends to happen with annexations. That's just how things go. So we have to divorce the legalese, the justifications, the excuses, all that, from the war itself and what they actually gain out of it. That is what we really need to do, because the reality is, what one says on paper, how one preaches, and what justifications one gives is very different from what one actually does, how they act, and what they actually achieve. These are 2 very separate groups of things, and they cross on occasion, yes. Sometimes people will be straight up honest and say, I want this, I'm taking this. Or, I want this, can I have this? And they'll be sincere. Sometimes that absolutely happens. But it's not guaranteed, nor is it very reliable, especially when it comes to states. Countries do not care as much about honesty because they got bigger priorities. You may say that's screwed up, and indeed in several ways it is. But it is how they play things, and you can't exactly change that. So just think about it with sincerity and with honesty. And state what you believe. Go ahead. Preach it. But do not get these things confused. The justification for a war is not the same as the war itself or the things done during it. There are separate things for what one legally believes, or rather what one legally states, and what one actually practices and thus demonstrates belief in. The United States is a classic example. We claim, in many ways, to believe in human rights, dignity, liberty, equality, yada 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 yada. Do we practice all these things? I mean, we practice some of them. You could argue to what extent, but we do practice some of them, and we leave the others out to dry. Because it's a state, and the state acts as the state deems best, or at the very least, best for its leaders, because that is what the state is, in truth. It's the administration in question, not necessarily the people as a whole, but rather just who's managing the wheel. Even if you don't like it, that's just how it is. And so things come from that, whether positive or negative. And the causes for war and the outcomes of it are no exception. War is just another example of people getting too caught up in legalese rather than actually looking at the world as it is. Because they will say, well, what about the rules regarding war? Or what about this? What about that? The moment things hit the fan, no one cares. I'll be frank. The state does not suddenly start caring about rules of war when they're getting their shoulders shot at. They may have some rules of engagement. Only engage in these terms or with these people. That's it. That is as far as they'll go, and most of those rules of engagement will be quite loose compared to normally because it's a freaking war. If someone shoots at you or holds a gun that's pointed in your general direction, you can shoot back. Sometimes the rules of engagement are that simple. Why? Because they don't want to freaking die. Nor do they want their soldiers to die. And so, they make things as necessary to ensure that happens. That's just how things are. You can preach about rules of war all you want. It's not going to save lives unless it's acted upon. And the legalese that justifies every single one of them isn't stopping someone pulling a stunt that breaks them. Using Iraq as an example, are those who listen aware of what Iraq did during the Iran-Iraq War? Well, they were losing ground, and I'll tell you what they did. They used chemical weapons with civilians around. Why? Because they wanted to push back the Iranian forces by any means. Iraq also invaded Kuwait and had lined up troops of Saudi Arabia, leading many to think they were going to invade the Saudis too. All that legalese about rules of war and what's a state legally allowed to do, they didn't care. Why would they? They had their own interests, so they acted accordingly. That legalese that the UN preaches, that they have in their documents, that didn't stop Jack. And so, we should treat your justifications, or the justifications of another state, in the same way. Why in the world would we think differently when that is exactly what we have seen time and again? It is simply suicide to pretend that suddenly things like Casus Belli, rules of war, and other things are just going to be used sincerely and without any ulterior motives or interests. No, that's not happening. It won't happen. Not as long as the current situation is as it is. You'd have to basically make humanity into perfect beings. That ain't happening. And so, let's just be honest and state sincerely our positions on war while ignoring the justifications, because frankly, those justifications are paper thin usually. And even if there's a good justification, what matters is the actions that are taken because of it. That is how it is. I can give plenty of justifications for war. But what matters, if such a justification leads to an actual conflict, is how people treat it, how people engage with the war itself. Justification's all fine and dandy, but the moment you think it suddenly changes how a conflict's going is the moment you become a fool. You could say it's for liberation, you could say it's for conquest, glory, God, any number of things. That ain't changing the situation on the ground. Have a good day, and I hope you enjoyed.